it's good to be seen and see. I didn't realize we were in here.
Yes, we'll be able to hear you better.
Yeah.
Jeff says he can do it.
Oh, thank you. The far door isn't open. Yeah, good.
We don't want them to think they can't come in.
Pardon me, darling?
We don't want them to think they can't come in.
Yeah. Oh God, my hair was all right.
Marvelous, darling.
Tell me, how are you doing?
We're doing well.
How's the ankle, leg, foot?
Hips are good. Getting the knee done December 23rd.
Oh, just before Christmas.
Yeah, I should have everything done by then, so.
So 2025.
We'll be good. They're all good. I'm on this side of the grass. They're all good.
You know something? Pardon me, dear. Yeah, I am, yeah. Do you find you forget some things? But I have, I know it. My neighbors are just wonderful. I mean, she'll call and say, I'm going to Wegmans, and I'll say. They know you're the girl with the booze on Fridays. That they're part of it. Oh, here comes some folks. Hi, Rich and Sue. This is nice in here. This is nice in here. It's cozier. And it is cold. How are you, Dolly? I did.
I'm stuffed.
Oh, he's stuffed. He's stuffed. I hear you had a nice time with Renee Fleming.
We did. Yeah, that worked out well.
I know this guy. Hi. Hi, dear.
So how's everything?
Everything's under control. Yeah.
That's all we can do.
That's all we can. And how's your brother doing? Good. Good.
Somebody gave me this. The Flores family used to exchange one gag gift every Christmas. And somebody gave me 50 called cheesy jokes. So especially for the cheesehead from Milwaukee, I've sent one of these out every day on a day 40 and 50 days. And every day he sends me a clever retort.
He usually starts his sermon with.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I've given him lots of ammunition.
Oh, I can imagine. Good, dear. How are you doing? Oh, it's good to be seen.
Yes,
I'll tell
all
you.
right, okay, great.
Good.
Well, I look forward to you renting, starting the journey with you. So I'm so glad you're doing it.
I'm happy to do it. As long as I can stand up, I'll come.
Okay, all right.
It's a deal.
Okay,
Good. Do you want us to get? Could we all sit down? Oh, how are you doing? Are you? Yep, thank God. We'll start with a small group and it will grow.
Well, welcome everyone, those who are here and those who are Zooming us. We're glad
And those
to
who are
join
here,
us.
but they're not.
And I think there's at least a couple I know that are Zooming, the Wolfords, so there we are. Hope you had a nice Thanksgiving Day, whatever you did, who you're with. And it's my joy to be here 69 years later after her graduation from Nazareth College.
I was
And
3 at the time, a prodigy.
And begin our Advent series. So, glorious season is going to move quickly. Oh my God, too quickly for me. And but glad to be here. And we will wait for that infamous question from Sue.
Did you want to say something, love?
No, you want me to say my famous saying, and I'm not going to do it.
Oh,
So you go.
okay, thank you. Thank you, Rob, and thanks, everybody. Welcome to our Advent Reflections, and particular welcome to all the folks online. And my Sisters of Mercy are plugged in, so I have to behave myself. Why start now? And it's so wonderful to have you join us for this season. Let me know if you have any issues, the hearing and so forth. But it's great to be in the chapel because the microphone doesn't become such a big issue, you know. So I'm grateful. We'll be meeting for 4 Saturdays. 3 of them will be from 10 to 11. Next week, because of First Penance, we'll meet here at noon. So for my sisters, next week, just come up after dinner or lunch in the dining room and turn it on, and you'll get it. So just so we know. My guess is that growing up in Lent carried more responsibilities with it than Advent. Would that be a fair guess? The heads say yes. And for many of us in Advent, the big thing was Santa and the gifts, and then seeing the crib in church. Today, I want to ask the question, what is there about this season that challenges us? And what is there about this season over 1,000 years ago that has something to say to us today? So what I'm going to do for 4 weeks, if the Holy Spirit works as I hope she will, today I want to discuss the culture into which the child Jesus was born and why that reality is important. Next week at noon, we're going to discuss at least 4 women whose background is a bit questionable and who are listed in Jesus' genealogy, according to Matthew. The third week, I want to discuss John the Baptist as a central figure in the early life of Jesus and what he has to say to us. And lastly, how can we really grasp the importance of the incarnation? So those are the 4 things I'm hoping to do, but I'm open to anything except being thrown out. Several weeks ago, I received a save the date announcement. You probably have done it, for a wedding coming in July of 2025. And I know why the family sent it, and I'm grateful. And I know why people have to do it early, because they've got to make all kinds of arrangements. But that notice coming in the mail made me think about folks who are beginning a new life and hope to bring children into the world. Can you imagine 100 years from now what people might say about us in 2024? There are smiles. Say what, honey? Yeah.
I don't know if she hears.
I can't hear you. Speak right up. Okay. Hi, honey. Okay. This young couple is speaking to me about what they hope for in 2025, and that notice brought thoughts to me. What would people say about us in 2020, well, 100 years from now, about 2024? What might they say about us, looking back at us?
I was thinking Bob was answering the question by saying, it'll take about a minute.
It'll take about a minute. Oh, thank you very much. It'll take about a minute. What might they say about us?
Well, look at the things we notice ourselves today.
What we noticed today?
Right. I mean, like, do we still want to talk politics, or is that over for another 4 years?
Okay.
However long? things have changed by then.
Okay,
Maybe they haven't.
okay.
Do we take better care of ourselves? That's something I always think about.
Yes, do we take better care of ourselves? And we might say, how has culture impacted our national life today? And I was with my grandniece, who's 16, yesterday, and even with her parents, the iPhone is out all the time. And so we have to realize that culture has impacted our national life. My parents, 90 years ago, had their children in the midst of the Depression and raised us during World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the impact of the Iron Curtain. And perhaps many of you remember that as well. Today, for a variety of reasons, some are delaying having children because of economic issues. And then children are born when their parents are older. Then that brought to my mind, think of the children born in 1860, when our nation was so divided that we went to war. And now we are evenly divided over a variety of issues. What are the issues that divide us? We can say it no matter what we think. Immigration divides us. Women's roles divide us. Race, abortion, economics, global warming, as well as foreign affairs. They all divide us. And I came to the decision that it is critical for us to understand the culture and the environment in which Jesus was born so we can grasp the importance of his life choices and the difficulties his friends and family faced. Just like it's important for me to remember the difficulties my parents faced having children in the Depression, or the difficulties grandparents face today when their grandchildren make decisions they wish they didn't. It's awfully important to understand the culture in which we live, others lived, and Jesus lived. And when you and I have studied the scriptures before, we learned the term, the text without context is pretext. The scripture text without context is pretext. And I'm taking that same statement and I'm applying it to the culture surrounding a person. It's critical to understand the context in which Jesus was born to understand his life choices. So his life choices without understanding his culture doesn't give us the complete picture. And just one little information point, all of our lives coming up, you and I have used the term BC and AD, right? Before Christ and in the year of God. Today, just for your information, if you do any extra reading, scholars use the term BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era, which shows you the power of Jesus' birth, that in the Western world, our calendars are arranged around his birth and life. The date of his birth is a bit off mark because it probably happened sometime a bit after 1 AD. Just, it's hard to get the history. So Jesus was born into a culture and a people who were monotheistic, believed their history, and God's actions made them a chosen people. So when you think about the culture into which Jesus was born, monotheism, one God, and we are chosen. He was born into that culture. Now, just a little background here, and raise your hand anytime I'm not being clear. We're talking about a people that at one time were 12 tribes. 12 tribes who had suffered defeat, division, civil war, exile, occupation, suffered as a people. And yet their chosenness held them together, and their belief in one God held them together. I often think about the persecution that Roman Catholics faced in New England in the 1800s with the Know Nothing Party. How they used to say, I don't know if you remember this, they used to say, oh, those nuns and priests, they had tunnels between the convent and the rectory. And we were not cared for. That's part of our culture. The people, Jesus' people, were a people who migrated from Egypt to seek food. And they grew so much that they became a threat to the Egyptians, became slaves, escaped, 40 years, sought what they hoped was their promised land. Remember, Joseph was sold by his brothers, and then eventually the whole family moved to Egypt. Jesus' people were a people of great prophets. We've discussed Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, and of great kings, particularly David. I often said God gave him a lot of leeway. David misbehaved, but he was part of God's heart. Now, eventually, the monarchy of David fell apart into two kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And the temple was in Judah. And the people were held together by their faith and a promise of a Messiah and the glory of this temple in which they believed God resided. We walk into church and we reverence the Eucharist. They believed God actually resided in that temple. So you can imagine how important it was to go there. And that temple was destroyed twice. Once by the Babylonians from the north, leveled it. And once by the Romans, leveled it. And if you go to Israel, you see parts of the wall, and that's it. That's it. Remember, you go and you put little notes in the wall and prayers. Their neighbors were not only pagans, but they were strong and presented a worry to the Jewish people. Babylonians to the north, Assyrians to the north, and of course, Rome. Rome would scare anyone. They created fear. Like I was listening today, and the president of Ukraine is talking about a possible peace plan and the recognition of their lands. Well, Russia has created fear among her neighbors. And there's one powerful example of Rome. There was a neighboring city to Nazareth called Sepphoris. Think of Mendon and Bloomfield. And Mendon, under the leadership of Rob Borsey, created some problems. And so what happened was Sepphoris was agitating against Rome. And what did Rome do? Marched in, blew up the city, leveled it, and killed everybody. Now, if that happened to Mendon, the people in Bloomfield would be very aware and behave themselves. So, to continue a bit of this culture, some of their, what they call their pagan neighbors, had their roots in Judaism. The Samaritans had their same roots as the Jews. So it's like us dealing with our Protestant brothers and sisters. We all have the same roots. And think of the common roots between the North and the South in the 1860s. The one great hope among the Jewish people was the promise of a Messiah. That was the hope they hung onto, and that they were chosen. And in Hebrew, the word is Messiah. In Greek, it is Christos. And there were a variety of views of what this Messiah would be like. It's like the views we have, what will a president do? What will a governor be like? Our mayor, and so forth. For some, that Messiah was going to be a warrior, and people would know he was in charge. For others, he would be a healer. For some, he would restore the glory of the people, the chosen people. For some, it was a movement, a messianic movement, a destiny for the people. The Messiah would settle problems between good and evil. And a lot of men came along and made claims they were the Messiah, but they failed, they weren't. All these stories are present in different forms in the Old Testament. The history of Israel and its place in religion are critical to understand to the life of Jesus. And the term Jew in time became derogatory. So does that background give you a picture of what it was like in the world in which Jesus was born? Some of the factors. Certainly. Time's up.
You said it was
No.
derogatory.
Yep.
Did it evolve to become derogatory? Or was it, that was how it was designed to come out?
Well, it was probably both.
Okay.
It was probably a bit of both. Any pressure against Rome would doom a nation.
Really?
Oh my gosh, well, just think of the Mendon and Bloomfield story. If Mendon started to say, well, Governor Hochul, we don't like you, and we're going to separate from the state, and you're going to do what we want. Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. So Rome leveled the city that went against them. So in time, what? Yeah, question?
Kleenex break.
Kleenex break. In time, the term Jew became derogatory. Now, any question about that? Just setting the scene. And it's into this culture that I've sort of laid out for you that approximately 16-year-old girl was chosen to bear a child. Her age to bear a child was not unusual in the day. Lifespan was shorter. Her role was to be faithful, to reverence her spouse, and to bear children, particularly a male child. It was critical to have a male child to carry on the legacy. She was betrothed to, we don't know, custom says he was older. I don't know if he was, but she was betrothed to Joseph. And that was such a solid bond that you didn't break it. Usually, sexual activity happened after the formal wedding, but sometimes when folks were betrothed. The other important thing for this young woman to remember that if she became a widow, it was an expectation that she marry her husband's brothers so they could produce a male child. That says a lot about the understanding of the role of women, doesn't it, in Jesus' time. She was betrothed to a carpenter. And Joseph's position when he and Mary were raising their child was what at that time we'd call middle class. It was very different from our middle class. And literacy in the time Jesus was born was not widespread. But the text does tell us that Jesus read the scriptures in the synagogue. But most folks were illiterate. And families lived together in communities, and religion was a unifying factor. And there were a variety of ways to express it. Getting to the temple was critical. But if you lived in Galilee, to get to the temple was a job and an expense. Some lived the Jewish law in communities, separated themselves from the rest of the folks, and formed a little community, and you can still see the remains of it, and some of you have seen it, the Essenes, near the Dead Sea. Religious practices were a uniting factor among the people, but for some, their economic situations prevented them from scrupulously following approximately 600 laws. I mean, if you were poor, how do you do the purity rites before every meal when you got to get back to the sheep?
And you don't read.
And you don't read. They were so hard for the average folks to comply, and they did their best. And one scholar says, because of their economic situation, they followed the little tradition. They did their very best, but the scribes and Pharisees really kept the letter of the law. Remember how Jesus got scorned because he didn't wash his hands properly before a meal. What a burden on people. So the purity laws were hard for every average folks to comply. And here you have this community of people, monotheistic, believing they're chosen, and living among polytheistic peoples. It was not easy. It was like, in the Civil War, it would be like a whole community of blacks trying to figure out how to survive in the South. And then you find these wonderful people like Harriet Tubman found ways to get them north, the Underground Railroad. Albert Nolan, a Dominican, is the author of Jesus Before Christianity, in other words, his early life, and shares what it was like when Jesus was born, because Jesus came from the north in Galilee, and they were considered second-class citizens. So you see, here's another thing. Because they were far from the temple, they couldn't get there regularly. They were many peasant people, and they were considered second-class citizens. Now, how does that understanding, what does that say to you about the life of Jesus coming into this environment? Does it say anything?
He wasn't a varsity player either.
I want to put that mic up, honey. It's on, love.
I was being facetious.
Say it, though. It's important.
He wasn't a varsity player either. You know, everything wasn't perfect in his little world. There was a lot he had to overcome.
That's right. A lot he had to overcome. Yes. Okay.
What's your understanding of the population of Nazareth? Was it 100% Jewish, or?
I don't know, but my sense is probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
So their community was united.
The communities were united.
But, surrounding villages may or may not have been.
Yeah, may or may not have been, but they were always under the cloud of a foreign invasion.
Well, I know the Romans controlled
The Romans
entire
contro-
area.
But prior to that, their history tells us that the Assyrians came in and wiped them out.
And then the Babylonians.
The Babylonians from the north came in and took them into exile and left probably the poorest of the poor. So they had a history of oppression from polytheistic, strong neighbors, and the strongest one was Rome. Strongest one was Rome.
Would it be safe to say that the Jews were somewhat like the black population in the South?
Well, I think you could maybe make that connection of a people oppressed,
Yes.
a people oppressed, a people with a vision for freedom. As King said, I've been to the mountaintop. And some people are still saying, I'm at the base of the mountain trying to get there.
The big difference with the Jews, though, is that they were very united because of their feeling that they were the chosen people.
That's right. They were united on many levels, but there were differences among them how well they could practice their religion because of their economic situations. But they were united, that they were chosen, and that they had one God.
Some had more money than others.
Oh, absolutely, some had more money, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Absolutely. It's just that when I think about the world into which I was born, in retrospect, war was my companion growing up. I'll never forget Life magazine coming with the pictures of the Holocaust survivors on the front. I had to be about 12. Think about that. And then Jesus hearing the stories of what happened to the neighbors when they went against Rome. They just wiped out the city. And Rome was known, the most severe punishment they gave was crucifixion. And sometimes in punishment for a community, they would crucify a whole road of people and set them on fire. We're not dealing here with, this makes Putin look like a wimp. In a way, you know. But Rome, and yet on the other hand, Rome made such contributions in literacy and architecture and roads. Yeah. So it's not one side of one story. Anybody else, any thought about any of this? Does it give you a slightly different picture? Yeah. Well, according to Albert Nolan, he has done research about the community into which Jesus was born, and things I never knew I wanted to share with you. He said the label poor in Jesus today, we might think economics, but in Jesus' day, the first group of poor were beggars. The blind, the deaf, the dumb, and the lame. That was a category that all fit under the title, the poor. And to add to that, I'll add to something. When you're crippled and blind or lame, the only way you can make a living is to beg. The only way anybody's going to, and if you had leprosy, stand back. They're not going to like you. So the poor had a much broader definition than what we think of today. And when you're poor and you don't get care, disease is very common. Disease is very common. Another group of people, the poor, were widows and orphans. And you remember Jesus spoke so tenderly about widows. And he told the parable about the one that her husband died and he had 6 brothers and they all died and they didn't produce a child. And somebody said, well, whose wife is she? And, but think about having to do that. To marry a brother-in-law so you can have children. That's hard. And orphans. Unskilled day laborers were called poor. And starvation could happen during war or a famine, but there was a bounty that people could get something to eat, but during war or famine. And one of the things, if you understand Eastern culture, when you are disgraced or poor, you are shamed. And shame is an awful thing to live with. A disgrace, humiliating. There were professions that were called sinful, unclean. Prostitutes were called sinful. Tax collectors were called sinful. Well, they weren't always the best in the game. Gamblers and robbers, and the uneducated and the illiterate. And when you were poor in Jesus' day, you were prone to more disease. And one thing I learned from Nolan, if you were a sinner, and they labeled them, you couldn't go to the synagogue. And that was the overwhelming population of the day. So this is the culture into which he was born. What does that say to us, if anything? Sue?
It's just that if he doesn't have I'm sorry, thank you. If he doesn't have an understanding of what's going on, who will? He has seen it all.
Right.
And what is he going to do about it?
That's the question. And that must have been a question for him. You know, there are big discussions. Did he really know who he was? Or did it come as a gradual revelation? I don't know the answer to that. But he was a sensitive man who had an understanding of the world in which he was born, and a gradual understanding of a call to minister to this world. And so that, yes.
Well, to me, a defining moment of that question is when he spent 3 days in the temple, when he was, 12 years old?
Yeah.
So,
Smart.
Before then, he lived a life that seemed to be a perfectly normal life.
For the time.
For the time and the station in life of his parents, who seemed to be hardworking young people with a job, with relatives that they were very close to, even if they would have to walk a few miles to see them. Nazareth, it's a small town, you know, and the little towns that are around them would have been walkable in those days, but they had support. I'm sure he had cousins. I'm sure I think he was happy. I think he was a normal child until he went to the temple.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but that is what I've always pictured in my life.
I think it was a normal upbringing for a Jewish child in a family considered middle class, but not well-to-do. Not well-to-do. Yes, darling.
Sometimes we see pictures of, thank you, I appreciate it. Lots of times we see pictures of beasts of burden in these scenes around Bethlehem or, you know. Was that a common occurrence to have a donkey or interesting?
Well,
it had to be expensive.
Yeah, but I think with shepherds, they slept right with their sheep because they had to be on guard that they would be stolen. Jim?
The fact that Jesus came from that type of family, that class and so forth, and most of the people were illiterate in that area, he said, that I can see why when this 12-year-old whatever boy comes into the temple, who should pay attention to him? What does he know? You know, I mean, he's at a different class, and so especially the scribes and the Pharisees take issue with whatever he says.
Yeah. And they were impressed.
They were impressed.
They were
Not all of them.
Not all of them. And as time went on, he understood. This is the thing about him that I admire. He understood how difficult it was for people to shed the shame they carried because of who they were. My father changed his name. My mother, big-time Irish. My father, big-time Italian. But do you think his brothers and sisters were going to get a job in Rochester with a vowel at the end of their name? No way. No way, Jose. And so it continues, that's what I'm saying, it continues the way in which we delineate people and who's acceptable and who's not. And that 613 laws, well, if you spend your whole life in the temple, you can probably purify everything. But if you're out working in the fields, you do your best. But you can't be ritually pure because you just haven't got the time or the money or the energy to do it. But you're a faithful Jew.
You know, I often wonder, the male Jews
Yes.
sitting in the temple and talking about all the laws, because they argued the laws.
They did what?
They
honey?
argued the laws.
They argued the
between
law.
themselves
That's right.
to make sense out of the laws. And I just often wondered that they would do that year after year after year after year, or if they just grew up being lazy to other things. You know, they were set aside as scholars, as holy men.
Yes.
But it seemed to me if you were male and you tried to become one of these people that sat in the temple and argued every day, that you were able to do that.
Yes. And also, many inherit the position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I suppose it's like living in the Vatican, and you think you have to do everything perfectly, although we know they don't. But if you're up somewhere near Galilee taking care of a vineyard, how do you get home to purify your hands when you got to have a little lunch? It was a burden for people, but they believed in that one God and their chosenness, just like the scribes and Pharisees. So I thought about these various populations that Nolan shares with us, and then I said to myself, well, what are the categories that we have today that divide us, just as they had them in the first century? And the first one that came to my mind was migrants. Now, we have a lot of different views about that, and I don't want to get into it. But even legal migrants, like the Haitians, have a tough time. They have a tough time, accused of eating people's dogs. Transgender folks, and your views can be one thing or another, but those of us that know families that have transgender children know that suicide was a thought for kids until they could get themselves settled. There is a member of the House of Representatives who does not want a transgender woman using the women's bathroom. Really? I mean, we don't go to the bathroom because of the sex of a person. We go because we have a need. Muslims are a category in some places today that aren't welcome. Look at the prejudice against Jews that still exist. Racial issues. Gay issues. I mean, there are categories today that divide us just as there were in Jesus' day. But the thing is, Jesus made a difference. He made a difference. And I wonder, why? Remember, he was criticized for eating with sinners, maybe prostitutes or tax collectors. He related to all kinds of people. He was a relatable people. He believed he was there to restore the faith of the people, and he rose up and over his culture while respecting it. This is a dramatic person who came into our world in a culture that had so many people feeling shame. Just amazing. And he was born and experienced all aspects of that culture, and at times paid a huge price for it. And so my question is, what do you and I long for this Advent of 2024? Are there any similarities we experience that he experienced 1,000 years ago? And a hush fell over the room.
When we come here and gather, I'm always a little overwhelmed and intimidated. But you know what? I come away with an understanding of my faith that I didn't know I had. And I appreciate it, and I love you for that. Jesus had a hard road, guys. This wasn't all fun and games and let's get to the party and put the cross up. I mean, it was a hard road. And I don't know if, I'd like to say I could be like that, but I'm not sure I can.
Well, I'm not sure any of us would say the same thing. The point is, we get a picture now of what his culture was like, and he moved against the culture, and he paid a price. He paid a price. Allowing a prostitute to wash his feet. Going to the home of Zacchaeus, a tax collector. Laying hands on a leper. Curing a paralyzed person. He went against the norm of his culture. And he paid a price. So the question, I think, for us, for Advent 2024, what do we long for as this season begins tonight and tomorrow? What does our heart long for?
For peace.
Peace.
World peace.
World peace. Hope. What price are we willing to pay? It's, and think about the Advent over 1,000 years ago as this young child grew. I'm not sure. Remember, he's totally human and totally divine. There's a big debate. When did he figure out he was God? I don't know the answer to that. But you wonder as he's coming up and seeing what's going on around him, and who were accepted and who weren't. And the struggles people had to be paralyzed, to have epilepsy, to be blind, and have the community feel, well, your parents were responsible. He observed all of this, and when he came of age, it changed him, I think. And he became absolutely relatable to people who did not want to relate to other people. He'd sit down with tax collectors. He'd maybe grab a bite on the Sabbath and he'd be criticized. He cured on the Sabbath, but they'd always get their horse out of a thing if they had to. He did things that were contrary to his culture, and he paid a price. And it's into this culture that he is born. So, an unusual man.
Did he have any choices?
Well, he did make choices. The Pharisees would say, well, why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? Well, he liked them. I have a sense that he really liked people, and he understood the situations they were in, and he was willing to extend himself to them. Yeah. And he used them in his parables. Remember the parable of the woman who's lost 7 husbands and didn't have any male children? Well, whose wife would he be? And he said, oh, please. Oh, please. That's not an issue. And the person who had talents, he used his culture to explain his views.
How did he survive overturning the tables in the temple with a...
Well, a few days later, we knew they probably couldn't even believe what they were watching. The Gospels record that event at different times, but he was, by his choice and by his call, he was gradually alienating the religious leaders of his day. And Rome Pilate, I think Pilate saw something special in him, but didn't follow through. But if you were a threat to Rome, stand back. Stand back. So this is the first of 4 lectures setting the context in which this man, Jesus, was born, grew up, felt called, and began to minister. And in about 3 years, he found himself in deep trouble. Does this help any? Yeah. And
can we talk a little bit about Mary and what she was going through during this time?
Well, Mary I think she was a rather unusual woman. I don't think it was easy for her to tell Joseph what had happened to her. But then she gave birth to the son, and according to Luke, she and her cousin Elizabeth visited, and their 2 sons were going to make a huge difference in the world. And as the scriptures unfold, and Jesus is making his choices to sort of go counterculture and serve the people that others said were poor and don't bother, she got worried about him. And there's a text in Scripture that she and his brothers went and wanted to talk to him. In other words, I think they wanted to say, you got to come home here. You're going to be in trouble. I think she worried. I don't know, I don't have children, but I've watched my nieces, and sometimes they worry themselves crazy about kids.
Well, she was a young girl who had her meeting with the angel who told her that she was going to be the mother of a special son. Do you think she remembered that all the time between 0 and 12 years old when she goes looking for him? And he says to her, Why are you looking for me?
Well, I'm sure she probably never forgot it. But you know, you go about the business of raising children and it all seems normal and then he disappears. Yeah. I don't think it was easy for her.
Well, I don't either. I think she paid the price,
She paid a
Big time.
price, a huge price.
big time.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, right now, to look, beginning Advent, look at Matthew and Luke, and they're very different. One focuses on Mary, one focuses on Joseph.
Right.
And we, in our romantic lives, have tried to blend the stories, the infancy and narratives. And it's very interesting to look at them and study the differences. You know, focus on Mary, you're raising Sue, but focus on another author, on Joseph. Which I find curious.
Well, it's like someone I had in retreat, and I think I've mentioned it before, and she said, the gospel writers were like pastors, and a table was in the middle of the floor, and all the stories about Jesus were on the table. And Mark, the earliest as a pastor, understood his community, and he said, what am I going to take from that table that will help my community? And Luke comes along, draws heavily from Mark, doesn't have to repeat what Mark did, and he said, well, I've got a Gentile community. Are there some stories here that are going to enrich my community? And he pulls from the table. And Matthew does the same. And John is much different, much later. But it's interesting. It's interesting. But what I hope today is that we can get a sense of how countercultural he really was, and relatable, and loved the law, loved his faith, loved his family, but he was realistic about what people could do and how they were suffering. And he paid a huge price, huge price. So next Saturday, we're going to look at 4 questionable women. I'm not one. Who are listed in Jesus' genealogy. And I think it's fascinating. And we'll figure out who they were, what they did, and why they were connected to him. And then we go to John the Baptist. And then at the very end, the question of Advent and its impact today. Okay, Rob?
Thanks, Barb. I want to put a commercial in.
Oh, okay, honey. It'll.
And so this weekend, we're inviting people to bring a shoe. I bought this in 1975 in Holland. It was my size. I have the other one too. And we're inviting people to bring socks for women, children, and men. They were going to donate and bring them to wherever we're going to worship this weekend. And between now and next week, St. Nicholas is probably going to bring a little treat into your shoe. So I invite you to be generous and bring some warm socks for our men, women, and children in our community. And thanks, Barb. It was a great beginning for Advent. Thank you very
honey.
much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, those folks online. Next week, noon. And if you're not here, I can talk to the wall. Don't worry.
Probably have.
I probably have talked to the wall. People have said she needs help. Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
mean, the effort.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thanks, everybody, for coming. Enjoy.
Wow.
Move carefully.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, kids.